At dinner, my son-in-law stood up and mocked me in front of everyone, never realizing what I would do next. One moment the table was filled with laughter and warmth, and the next all eyes turned as he made me the center of his little show. What followed changed the entire evening in ways no one could have imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. The evening had started out as a simple family dinner. The house smelled of roasted chicken, garlic, mashed potatoes, and warm bread straight from the oven. My daughter had invited us all over, saying it was meant to be a night of unity, a gathering where generations could sit together and share a meal. I had dressed neatly, wearing the same blazer my late wife always said made me look distinguished. I even brought along a bottle of red wine I had been saving for years, hoping it would add a touch of celebration to the evening. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. My granddaughter ran around the table giggling. My daughter Sarah flitted in and out of the kitchen, and I thought perhaps for once life had given me a pocket of peace. But peace has a way of shattering when pride enters the room. My son-in-law Derek never quite knew how to respect boundaries. He had always carried himself like someone who thought the world owed him an applause. He was younger than me by nearly 3 decades, yet he looked at me with the kind of smirk one reserves for a fool. That night, he took it a step further. We were midway through dinner when Derek tapped his glass with a spoon, commanding everyone's attention as though he were giving a speech at a banquet. The room quieted, and he grinned, eyes scanning the table until they rested squarely on me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice just enough to fill the room, "I have a toast. But before I do, let me share a little story about our beloved patriarch here." At first, I thought he was going to say something kind, maybe a compliment about my years of hard work or the sacrifices I had made. But instead, what came out of his mouth cut sharper than any blade. He mocked the way I dressed, joking that I looked like a relic from the past who refused to admit his time was over. He teased my careful habits, saying I was too cautious, too boring, and that it was no wonder people my age were better suited for retirement homes than dinner tables filled with young energy. The table erupted with awkward laughter, some forced, some nervous. My daughter gave him a warning look, but Derek shrugged it off like a comedian sure of his punchline. He wasn't done. He leaned forward, pointing at me with his fork, and said, "You see, this man thinks he still has authority, but we all know he's just holding on to scraps of relevance. Isn't that right?" For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. My fork froze midway to my mouth. My granddaughter stared at me with wide, confused eyes. And in that pause, a storm built inside me, quiet but undeniable. He thought he had won the room with his cheap mockery. What he didn't realize was that he had opened a door he would soon regret. I took a slow sip of wine, placed the glass down carefully, and smiled. Not with anger, but with the calmness of a man who had already decided his next move. I looked around the table, locking eyes with each person, and then back at Derek. My voice was steady when I finally spoke. "You think tonight will be remembered for your little performance?" I said. "But I promise you, Derek, everyone here will remember what comes after far longer than they will remember your joke." The tension was electric. The guests shifted uneasily, sensing something was about to break. My daughter's hand trembled as she set down her napkin. Derek laughed again, though it was thinner this time, less certain. He didn't yet understand that in mocking me publicly, he had underestimated the quiet power of a man who had endured loss, sacrifice, and years of silent strength. That night was not going to end the way Derek expected. And as I sat there, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver my response, I knew that what came next would not only silence the room, but change everything about how my family saw me, and more importantly, how they saw him. When people look at a moment of betrayal, they often think it comes out of nowhere, as if one small insult or act of cruelty suddenly appears and cuts deep. But the truth is that every betrayal is built on a foundation of years, and mine was no different. Long before that dinner, before my son-in-law ever raised his glass to mock me, there were decades of sacrifice that had shaped me and my daughter's life. I was not just a man sitting at a table enduring humiliation. I was a widowed father who had carried the weight of 2 lives on my shoulders since the day my wife died. That story begins in a quiet hospital room when I was in my early 40s, clutching my daughter Sarah's hand with one arm while holding my wife's lifeless one with the other. From that moment on, I promised myself I would give my daughter every opportunity in life, no matter what it cost me. The years that followed were filled with long shifts at work, sometimes 2 jobs at once, just to make sure the bills were paid and Sarah had what she needed. I worked at the factory during the day and picked up repair jobs in the evenings, coming home long after sunset with my hands stained by grease and my back aching from lifting more than I should have. When Sarah needed braces, I took on overtime. When she wanted piano lessons, I found a way, even if it meant patching my own shoes instead of buying new ones. I skipped vacations, avoided restaurants, and poured every spare dollar into her future. People told me I was too generous, that children needed to learn the value of hard work by going without sometimes. But I never believed in letting her suffer for something she didn't choose. Losing her mother was already a burden no child should bear. I refused to add another. As she grew older, my sacrifices only deepened. By the time she reached high school, Sarah had dreams of attending college out of state. I knew the costs would be enormous, but I never once discouraged her. Instead, I pulled money from every corner of my life. To make it possible, I cashed out savings bonds, borrowed against what little retirement I had, and even sold off my old car to avoid loans that would weigh her down later. When the tuition bills arrived, I paid them in full, watching as she packed her bags with excitement, never letting her see the quiet tears I shed in the garage after she drove away. It was not sadness that she was leaving. It was pride mixed with the ache of years of self-denial finally becoming visible in the form of her dreams taking flight. Through her 20s, the support never stopped. She moved into an apartment, and when rent was too high, I stepped in. When her car broke down, I paid for the repairs. When she wanted to travel with friends, I slipped her extra money so she could enjoy herself without worry. And when she met Derek, the man who would become my son-in-law, I extended that same generosity to him. I paid for dinners when we went out together, helped them furnish their first home, and even supported them when their jobs hit rough patches. At the time, it never felt like a burden. It felt like love. The hardest part of raising Sarah alone was not the work or the money. It was the silence in the evenings, the missing voice of my wife who should have been there beside me. Every graduation, every birthday, every milestone, I wish she could see how beautifully our daughter was growing up. I carried that grief quietly, never letting it show, because I wanted Sarah's memories to be filled with joy, not sadness. My role was to be her foundation, solid and unwavering, no matter how much weight pressed down on me. By the time she was in her 30s, I believed I had done everything a father could do. I had raised her without complaint, supported her without hesitation, and loved her without condition. Every bill I paid, every dollar I spent, every hour I worked beyond exhaustion was proof of my commitment. And yet, All of that sacrifice led to the moment at that dinner table, where the man she had chosen to marry decided to strip me of my dignity in front of her. What no one saw at that moment was the years of labor and sacrifice standing behind me like silent witnesses, the countless nights of worry, the decades of giving. That was the life I had lived before the mockery, the truth that made his insult cut deeper than any words alone could. As I sat there listening to the laughter that followed his cruel remarks, I thought back to all those years, all those nights when I had given up so much so my daughter could have everything. And for the first time, a seed of clarity began to grow inside me. If I had carried so much for so long, perhaps it was time to ask what exactly I had been carrying it for. Money is never just money in a family. It is time, sweat, and sacrifice, turned into paper bills and numbers on a bank statement. It is love disguised as tuition payments, care hidden inside grocery bags, and security tucked into envelopes slid quietly across a table. For me, money was never about accumulation. It was about giving. After my wife passed, I learned quickly that raising a daughter alone required not only emotional strength, but also a relentless commitment to provide. What began as a father's natural responsibility evolved into a lifelong pattern of financial support that shaped both my life and Sarah's. Even after she graduated from college, the thread of financial help never truly ended. When Sarah was in her early 20s and just starting out in the working world, she struggled with the same challenges most young adults face. Rent was steep, utilities added up, and emergencies always seemed to appear at the worst times. Whenever she called, her voice carrying a mix of hesitation and hope, I never let her finish before assuring her I would help. I told myself it was temporary, that once she found her footing, she would stand strong on her own. Yet years went by, and the calls continued. I never questioned them, because my love for her was greater than my need to hold on to money. When she met Derek, I extended that same generosity toward him, believing that supporting her meant supporting the life she was building with him. Their first apartment had a deposit larger than they expected, and I stepped in without hesitation. Their utility bills were high during the winter months, and I covered them more than once. When the refrigerator broke down, I replaced it. When they struggled with car trouble, I paid for repairs. I even slipped them grocery money in envelopes when I knew their paychecks would not stretch far enough. Every dollar I handed over felt like an invisible thread, weaving my daughter's happiness together, binding her comfort and security with the labor of my own hands. The truth is, I had put off my own retirement for years without truly admitting it to myself. While others my age were talking about traveling, downsizing, or taking up hobbies, I was still punching in at work, still carrying the weight of financial obligations that were no longer mine to bear. I told myself it was worth it, that seeing Sarah comfortable was more important than any dream I could chase for myself. My retirement savings dwindled not because of recklessness, but because I kept dipping into it for her needs. Even the engagement ring Derek gave her, a sparkling piece that drew compliments from friends and family, had been partly funded by me. He presented it as if it were his own grand gesture of love, but I knew the quiet truth of where part of that money had come from. When the wedding was planned, the expenses grew larger, and once again I was there to fill the gaps. The venue deposit alone cost more than a year's worth of my old mortgage payments, but I wrote the check with a smile, telling myself it was for Sarah's happiness. The photographer, the catering, even some of the decorations bore the fingerprints of my financial help. I never announced it or asked for recognition. I did it because I believed that was what love looked like. Providing silently, ensuring that the people you care for never go without. Over time, my financial thread became so tightly woven into their lives that I wondered if they even noticed it anymore. The support I gave was no longer an event. It was routine. It was expected. The small loans I never asked to be repaid, the bills I covered before they were due, the meals I funded whenever we dined together were all part of the invisible safety net I created for them. I thought of it as generosity, but later I realized it had turned into something else. It had become dependence. Looking back, I see now how dangerous that dependence was. Each check I wrote, each expense I covered added to the silent belief that I would always be there, that my sacrifices had no end. My love and devotion were being translated into financial obligation, and slowly, what had started as a gift became an expectation. What they did not realize, what even I had not fully admitted, was that every dollar I spent came with a cost, not just to my bank account, but to my peace of mind and my future. At that point in my life, I could have been traveling. I could have been investing in hobbies I never had time for. I could have been resting after decades of work. Instead, I was still living with the mindset of a man raising a child, except my child was now grown and married. It was as if I had been trapped in a cycle, giving and giving while asking for nothing in return. That financial thread tied me to them so tightly that I forgot it was mine to cut if I ever chose to. What I did not know then, as I continued to quietly fund their lives, was how much that generosity would soon be tested. My sacrifices, once invisible, would be twisted into weakness. The very thread I had spun with care would be tugged at, mocked, and used against me in a way I never expected. But in that moment, before the dinner that changed everything, all I knew was that my love for my daughter had been expressed in one unbroken chain of financial sacrifice, a chain that had become far heavier than I ever realized. It was on a quiet Thursday evening when the phone rang, and Derek's voice came through with an unfamiliar tone of warmth. He rarely called me directly, preferring to go through Sarah if there was ever a need to speak. This time was different. He spoke with a polite, almost rehearsed cheerfulness, asking if I would join him and Sarah for dinner at an upscale restaurant in the city. His words carried a weight of formality, as though the invitation was not just about sharing a meal, but about setting the stage for something larger. He mentioned there was something important he wanted to discuss, and while he left the details vague, the implication was clear enough that I could not refuse. At first, I was surprised by the gesture. Derek had never gone out of his way to make me feel included, and our interactions up until that point had been polite but distant. He tolerated my presence, occasionally asked shallow questions, and moved on quickly, as though conversation with me was a duty rather than a choice. To hear him extend an invitation, and to hear the effort in his voice, stirred a mixture of curiosity and caution within me. I accepted without hesitation, but in the back of my mind, I wondered what his true intentions might be. As I hung up the phone, I thought about my daughter and how she must have influenced the invitation. Sarah always valued moments of connection, and perhaps she had urged Derek to take a step toward building a stronger bond with me. That thought softened my skepticism and filled me with a quiet hope. After all, I had invested years into their lives, and maybe, finally, Derek was beginning to recognize that I was not just a supporting figure on the sidelines, but a man whose presence mattered. I decided to treat the evening as an opportunity to bridge the gap between us. I took the time to press my shirt, polish my shoes, and comb my hair with a care I had not bothered with in years. I even selected a tie that Sarah had given me on Father's Day long ago, its colors faded slightly but still carrying the memory of her small hands, wrapping it around a gift box with pride. It was a symbol of love, a reminder of the bond I had fought to protect through every sacrifice. Wearing it felt like a silent way of carrying that bond with me into the dinner. As the day approached, I imagined what the important discussion might be. Perhaps Derek wanted to talk about future plans, about buying a house or starting a family, and maybe he hoped to involve me in those conversations. The idea made me smile. I envisioned myself offering guidance, sharing stories of perseverance, and feeling for once like my role in Sarah's life was valued beyond financial support. I even thought that Derek might thank me for all I had done, acknowledge in front of my daughter that my years of help had not gone unnoticed. Those thoughts filled me with cautious optimism, and for the first time in a long while, I looked forward to the evening with genuine anticipation. On the day of the dinner, I drove into the city early, wanting to make sure I arrived on time. I had always believed punctuality was a form of respect, and I wanted to show them that I took this invitation seriously. As I parked my modest car among rows of luxury vehicles, I felt a brief flicker of self-consciousness, but I pushed it aside. I reminded myself that the kind of man I was could not be measured by the model of his car. My worth had always been in my dedication, my loyalty, and my sacrifices. Those were things no money could ever buy. The restaurant itself was elegant, its entrance lined with golden lights that shimmered against the glass doors. Couples and groups of friends walked past me, dressed in fine clothes, their laughter carrying in the night air. I stepped inside, greeted by the scent of polished wood and freshly cooked meals that spoke of refinement. A host, in a sharp suit, led me to the table where Derek and Sarah were already seated. Derek rose with a broad smile, pulling out a chair for me in an exaggerated gesture of politeness, while Sarah beamed, her eyes filled with warmth. "Glad you could make it," Derek said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Tonight is special." Those words lingered as I sat down. Something in his tone struck me as unusual, a little too polished, a little too rehearsed, but I brushed the thought away. My daughter's smile anchored me in the moment, convincing me that whatever Derek had planned, it was meant to bring us closer together. I returned her smile, nodded at Derek, and prepared myself for whatever important discussion he was about to reveal. I could not have known then that this invitation, so carefully worded and warmly extended, was not a gesture of inclusion, but a stage being set. I could not see that the politeness was a curtain hiding a crueler intention. For the moment, I believed in the possibility of connection. I believed in the promise of respect. And that belief was what led me to sit at the table, unaware that the evening ahead would not bring the bond I had hoped for, but rather the moment that would unravel everything. The first thing I noticed as I walked into the restaurant was the air itself. It carried a rich mixture of aromas, a combination of freshly seared meats, butter melting on soft bread, and the sharp tang of wine being poured into tall glasses. The lighting was low but carefully designed, casting a golden glow that made every surface shine with elegance. Each table was draped in heavy white linen, with centerpieces of fresh flowers arranged so precisely that not a petal seemed out of place. Candles flickered in crystal holders, their flames swaying gently as servers glided past, with trays balanced on one hand. It was the kind of place where every detail screamed sophistication, where silence and refinement were bought as part of the experience. I had been in fine restaurants before, but never on my own account. Whenever I found myself in such settings, it was always because of Sarah or Derek, and more often than not, the bill quietly ended up in my hands. That thought echoed through me as I adjusted my blazer, looking at the gleaming silverware that lay neatly arranged in front of my plate. I knew enough about etiquette to recognize the multiple forks and knives, each with a specific purpose, and I thought of how different this was from the dinners I used to share with my wife and daughter at our modest kitchen table. Back then, dinner was a roast chicken on Sundays, the clatter of mismatched plates, and the sound of laughter spilling freely without any sense of decorum. It was not fancy, but it was ours. As I sat across from Derek, I could not ignore the extravagance of the world he seemed to thrive in. He wore a tailored suit that fit him as if it had been cut by a craftsman for his body alone. His watch glimmered when it caught the light, a subtle reminder of wealth that I knew, deep down, I had indirectly contributed to. Sarah sat beside him, radiant as always, her dress flowing gracefully, her smile bright. She looked comfortable in this setting, as though she had been born into it, though I knew she had not. I had worked hard to make sure she never felt the weight of financial struggle, and here she was, living in the life I had always dreamed for her. Yet there was a bitter irony that gnawed at me. So much of this lifestyle, this refinement and elegance, had been funded quietly by my own sacrifices, the same sacrifices that left me driving a modest car and living simply while they lived lavishly. I glanced around the room, taking in the other diners. They spoke in low voices, their laughter soft and controlled, their clothing pressed and flawless. Waiters moved silently, refilling glasses and adjusting plates as though performing a dance they had practiced 1,000 times. The walls were decorated with large framed paintings, each one illuminated by soft light, each one undoubtedly worth more than my monthly paycheck. It was a theater of wealth, and I sat there as both a participant and an outsider. A thought crept into my mind as I lifted my water glass. How many of these moments had I helped create without realizing it? The dinners they shared with friends, the vacations they posted pictures of, the home filled with furniture and appliances I had quietly paid for. I had been the silent architect of their comfort, never asking for acknowledgement, believing that love was expressed through provision. But in that room, surrounded by luxury, I began to feel the weight of irony pressing down on me. Derek leaned back in his chair, stretching an arm over the backrest with a confidence that belonged to someone who felt entirely at home in such a place. He ordered with ease, selecting dishes from the menu without glancing at the prices. Sarah followed his lead, smiling as she made her choices, while I hesitated briefly before settling on something simple. I told myself it was because I preferred modest meals, but the truth was that I felt more comfortable with simplicity. The server poured a glass of red wine for each of us, and as the rich liquid swirled in the glass, I found myself reflecting on how different my life could have been had I kept even a fraction of what I had given away. I thought of the retirement trips I had dreamed about but never taken, the hobbies I had once wanted to pursue, and the quiet home renovations I had postponed. All of it had been placed aside to build the life that now sat before me, polished and glamorous as though it had always been theirs by right. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt proud. Proud that my daughter had this life. Proud that she could sit in such a setting with confidence. Proud that she was spared the financial struggles I had endured. But pride quickly gave way to something else, something I could not yet name but felt stirring deep within me. It was not envy, and it was not anger. It was a quiet recognition that what I had built was no longer mine, that the sacrifices I had made had not only provided but had also separated me from the very people I gave them to. As Derek raised his glass to toast the evening, his smile wide and unguarded, I forced myself to mirror the gesture. I looked around the elegant restaurant once more, absorbing every detail, and I thought to myself that this was the stage Derek had chosen. He had chosen extravagance, he had chosen a public setting, and he had chosen to make whatever important discussion he had planned unfold under the glow of chandeliers and the eyes of strangers. I could not have known then how cruelly that choice would be used against me, but I felt the stirrings of something inevitable. The first part of the dinner passed without incident. We spoke about Sarah's work, about Derek's latest business ventures, and even about my granddaughter's school projects. The food arrived in elegant portions, each plate arranged with artistic precision, and for a while I allowed myself to believe that perhaps Derek's invitation had been genuine. Maybe, just maybe, this evening really was about connection, about appreciation, about acknowledging what I had done for them over the years. I sipped my wine, listened carefully, and nodded at the right moments, carrying myself with quiet dignity. But then, as the plates were being cleared, Derek tapped his spoon against his glass. A sharp little sound that cut through the murmurs of other diners and silenced our table instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice just enough to draw attention from the tables nearby, "I think it is time for a little story." My first thought was that he meant to offer a toast. I sat up a little straighter, prepared to be embarrassed in the gentle way that families often tease each other, perhaps with a funny anecdote about Sarah's childhood or even a joke about my stubborn habits. But what came out of his mouth was not affectionate teasing. It was something altogether different, something carefully aimed to reduce me in the eyes of everyone present. "You see," Derek began with a grin, "our beloved father-in-law here drives a car that looks like it belongs in a museum. I swear, when he pulls up to the house, the neighbors must think a history exhibit is in town." Laughter rippled across the nearby tables, diners turning their heads with amused expressions, not even knowing me, but willing to join in on the mockery because Derek's delivery was so bold. I forced a small smile, hoping the joke would end there, but Derek was only warming up. He leaned back in his chair, pointing his fork in my direction, and continued, "And have you seen those jackets he wears? Always the same style, like he walked straight out of a catalog from 30 years ago. You would think a man who has been so generous with his money might have upgraded his wardrobe by now, but no, he saves it all for us." He laughed loudly at his own words, the sound booming across the restaurant. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her eyes darted toward me, then back to Derek, her lips pressed into a thin line as though she wanted to speak but could not bring herself to interrupt him. My heart sank as I watched her remain silent, caught between loyalty to her husband and loyalty to her father, though in that moment her silence felt like a choice. The laughter from nearby tables grew louder as Derek raised his glass again. "But the best part," he said, his eyes sparkling with mischief, "is how old-fashioned he is. Always preaching about saving, about working hard, about doing things the traditional way. Times have changed, my friend, but you just refuse to move forward. It is no wonder we have to drag you into places like this, or else you would be eating soup at home in that little kitchen of yours forever." I felt the weight of every eye in the room on me. My fork lay untouched on the plate, my hands resting stiffly on the tablecloth as I tried to maintain composure. Inside, my chest tightened, my stomach churned, and my throat ached with the effort of swallowing words I wanted to say. His voice carried across the room, filling the elegant space with cruel amusement, turning me into the evening's entertainment. The humiliation was sharp, but what hurt most was not the laughter of strangers or the smugness of Derek's tone. It was the silence of my daughter. Sarah looked down at her lap, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she did not defend me. She did not say, "That is enough," or "Show some respect." She allowed the moment to continue, her discomfort hidden beneath a weak smile, as though she were simply trying to get through the night. That silence cut deeper than any of Derek's words. I glanced at the waiters moving quietly between tables, their faces expressionless as they carried trays and poured drinks. They had heard his words too, but their profession demanded neutrality. I was alone in the moment, the subject of ridicule, the target of laughter, in a place where I had been invited under the promise of appreciation. Derek took another sip of wine, clearly pleased with himself, and leaned closer as though sharing a final secret. "You see, everyone, this man here is proof that you can work your whole life and still not figure out how to live. He is our reminder that generosity without style is just charity. And thank goodness for that, because otherwise we would not be sitting here tonight enjoying this meal." His words stung like fire against my skin. I clenched my jaw, determined not to let him see the full measure of my pain. I told myself to stay calm, to breathe, to let the storm pass. I had lived through worse than public mockery. I had lived through loss, through endless nights of work, through the grief of raising a daughter alone. This was just another test, another trial to endure. Yet even as I sat there in silence, the humiliation burned itself into my memory, not as a passing insult but as a revelation. In that moment, I saw Derek clearly for who he was. I saw the arrogance, the entitlement, the lack of respect that he had carefully hidden behind charm and smiles. And I saw the cracks in my daughter's loyalty, the quiet choice she had made to remain still when she should have stood beside me. What Derek thought was a harmless display of wit was, in fact, the beginning of something far greater. He had mocked me publicly, reducing me to a caricature in front of strangers. But he had also planted the seed of clarity within me, a seed that would grow into something he could never have anticipated. The silence of my daughter weighed more heavily on me than all of Derek's cruel words combined. His mockery was sharp, humiliating, and meant to draw laughter at my expense, but I could have endured it with dignity had Sarah spoken up. Instead, she lowered her eyes, her hands folding the napkin in her lap over and over, twisting the fabric between her fingers as though it could distract her from the moment unfolding before her. She glanced at me once, a fleeting look filled with discomfort, but her lips never parted to stop her husband's cruelty. That single silence cut deeper than the laughter of strangers or the arrogance of Derek's voice. I remembered Sarah as a child, running through the yard with scraped knees, always rushing into my arms when she stumbled. Back then she trusted me to protect her from everything, even the smallest pain. I was her shield, her guide, the one she looked to when the world seemed too big or too frightening. I thought of the nights I had stayed up late to help her with school projects, the mornings I had woken up early to braid her hair before work, and the promises I had whispered at her mother's bedside that I would never let Sarah feel abandoned. Every memory rose up in my mind as I sat there, hearing Derek's voice echo with laughter, while Sarah's silence became louder than anything else in the room. She was not a child anymore, and I no longer expected her to need me as she once had. But I had never imagined she would sit by and let me be ridiculed so openly. It was not just Derek's words that wounded me, but the absence of hers. I longed for her to say, "That is enough," or to reach across the table and take my hand to show me that she still saw me as her father, deserving of respect and love. Instead, she remained still, caught between two loyalties, and in that moment she chose the one sitting beside her in a tailored suit and polished smile. I studied her face as she forced a weak smile for the sake of appearances. She looked torn, as though some part of her knew she should intervene, yet another part feared the consequences of crossing Derek. The realization struck me with a force I could not ignore. My daughter, the girl I had raised with love and sacrifice, had learned to fear displeasing her husband more than disappointing her father. She had grown into a woman whose silence protected the man who mocked me rather than the man who had carried her through every hardship. The other diners chuckled quietly, their amusement fading as the weight of the moment became clear. Even strangers could see the cruelty in Derek's performance, yet my daughter remained voiceless. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, my pulse pounding as I forced myself to keep calm. I would not give Derek the satisfaction of seeing me break. But deep within me, something shifted. The years of sacrifice, the endless giving, the patience I had shown were colliding with the reality of my daughter's silence. I thought of the many times I had stepped in to solve her problems, the bills I had paid when she was short on money, the groceries I had delivered when she could not afford them, the repairs I had funded so her car would not leave her stranded. I thought of the 25-0 wedding deposit I had written from my retirement savings without hesitation, believing I was giving her the future she deserved. Every act of love had been given freely, but in that moment I realized how easily those sacrifices had been overshadowed by her quiet loyalty to a man who had given so little compared to what I had. Her silence was not just a choice in that moment. It was the echo of years of taking my support for granted. Derek's voice filled the air, his words cruel but hollow, yet Sarah's silence had weight. It pressed down on me with the force of betrayal, not loud or explosive, but steady and undeniable. I caught her eyes again, and for a second I thought I saw regret flicker there, a silent apology she did not know how to give. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the strained smile of a woman trying to keep peace at a table where respect had already been shattered. I sat quietly, my hands resting on the linen tablecloth, my posture straight, my face calm. Outwardly, I appeared composed, but inside I was unraveling. The daughter I had devoted my life to had left me alone in that moment, abandoned not with words, but with the absence of them. And as I stared at the glass of wine in front of me, untouched and glowing red in the candlelight, I understood something I had never wanted to admit. The bond between us was no longer what it had once been. It had changed, eroded slowly over time, until it could no longer withstand the weight of Derek's cruelty. I did not show it then, but in my heart a resolve began to form. Derek thought his words had been the dagger, but it was Sarah's silence that truly pierced me. That silence would be the thing I carried home with me that night, and it would be the reason I began to see clearly what had been hidden in plain sight. The laughter faded eventually, leaving behind an uncomfortable hush that lingered over our table like a fog no one wanted to acknowledge. Plates clinked as servers cleared them. Wine glasses were topped off, and conversations resumed around the room, but for me, the world had narrowed to the space between myself, Derek, and Sarah. My daughter's silence had already pierced me in ways no words could, and now I sat in a stillness so profound that even my own breathing seemed too loud. My face gave nothing away, my posture rigid, my hands folded neatly in my lap. On the surface I looked like a man simply listening, but inside me a storm was forming, quiet yet undeniable. I did not respond to Derek's mockery. I did not try to defend myself, nor did I attempt to lighten the mood with humor. Instead, I stared at him, my eyes fixed on his face with a calmness that unsettled him more than anger ever could. He shifted in his seat, smirked, and took another sip of wine as though to prove he was unaffected. But I saw the flicker of unease behind his expression. People like Derek thrive on reaction, on drawing out humiliation so they can bask in their own power. By refusing to give him that satisfaction, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming control, even if no one else in the room realized it yet. Sarah's gaze flickered between us nervously, her smile fragile and strained. She tugged at her napkin again, folding and unfolding it as though her fingers could unravel the tension spreading across the table. She avoided meeting my eyes, but I felt her discomfort as clearly as if it had been written on her face. I wanted to ask her why she had not spoken up, why she had not defended me when I had defended her all her life, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat in silence, my stare locked on Derek, a man who thought he had won the evening. Inside me, the humiliation twisted into something sharper, something colder. Pain has a way of transforming when it settles in long enough, and mine was shifting into clarity. As I stared at Derek, I saw not just a smug young man with a cruel sense of humor, but the truth behind years of small slights, of arrogance disguised as confidence, of charm that masked entitlement. He had never respected me, not in the beginning, not in the years I had supported them, and certainly not in that moment. What he had done tonight was not spontaneous. It was deliberate. It was a declaration not only to me but to everyone present that he saw me as small, as outdated, as insignificant. The silence gave me space to think, and in that stillness I began piecing together the pattern of his behavior. The expensive meals he always allowed me to pay for, the casual comments about my old car or modest home, the way he accepted my financial help without gratitude, as if it were his due. Tonight was simply the first time he had chosen to strip away the politeness and reveal the disdain beneath it. I realized then that his respect had never been lost because it had never existed in the first place. I sat back slightly, still keeping my gaze steady, and let the calm wash over me. I had been humiliated, yes, but I was not broken. A man who has worked 2 jobs to raise a daughter alone, who has faced the grief of burying a wife, who has sacrificed dreams and comforts for decades, cannot be broken by the cruel jokes of a younger man. My silence, my stare, my composure in that moment were not signs of weakness. They were the beginning of something Derek would not see coming. The room around us blurred. I could hear the faint notes of a piano drifting through the restaurant, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the low hum of conversations. But none of it mattered. My world had narrowed into a single point, the quiet resolve building within me. I no longer felt the sting of Derek's mockery. Instead, I felt a strange sense of control, as if my silence was teaching me more than words ever could. Sarah finally looked at me then, her eyes wide, searching my face for a reaction. What she saw was not anger, not wounded pride, but a stillness she could not interpret. That was intentional. I wanted her to see that I would not lash out, that I would not create a scene. My silence was my shield, and in that moment it was stronger than any defense I could have spoken. She lowered her eyes again, unable to hold my gaze, and I felt the distance between us widen. Derek chuckled once more, softer this time, almost forced, as if to reassure himself that he had maintained the upper hand. But I saw the way his eyes darted to mine and lingered a little too long. He could not read me, and that unsettled him. My silence was louder than any retort I might have given, and in it he began to sense that perhaps the victory he thought he had won was not so certain after all. As I stared at him across that polished table, I understood something with complete clarity. This moment was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. The humiliation I had endured was real, but it had lit a fire inside me that neither Derek nor Sarah had anticipated. My silence was not surrender. It was the birth of resolve. I excused myself from the table with the calm politeness of a man who seemed untouched by what had just unfolded. Derek smirked and lifted his glass again as if to toast his own performance, while Sarah nodded faintly, relieved, perhaps, that I had chosen not to create a scene. I rose slowly, adjusted my blazer, and walked toward the back of the restaurant where the restrooms were located. My steps were steady, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of humiliation that I refused to let show on my face. To the other diners, I looked like any man on his way to wash his hands, but inside, my thoughts churned with the echo of Derek's laughter and Sarah's silence. The hallway to the restrooms was quieter than the dining area, lined with framed artwork and softly glowing sconces. I paused briefly at the sink, letting cold water run over my hands, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The man who looked back at me was older, yes, with lines etched deep from years of labor and sacrifice, but his eyes still carried the same strength they always had. I thought of my wife in that moment, of the promises I had made to her when she was taken too soon, promises I had lived by all these years. Looking at myself, I whispered silently that I had not failed her, even if tonight felt like a test beyond measure. As I turned to leave, voices drifted down the hallway. At first I paid them no attention, assuming they were other diners waiting for a table. But then I caught Derek's name, followed by his laugh, and my steps slowed. The voices grew clearer as I rounded the corner, careful to stay out of sight. Derek was there, with another man, a friend perhaps, leaning casually against the wall near the bar. He spoke freely, his tone sharp and arrogant, unaware that I was only a few steps away, listening. "You would not believe how easy it is with him," Derek said, his voice dripping with confidence. "The old man is an open wallet. Always has been, always will be. All I have to do is act polite, let him think he is part of things, and he hands over the money without hesitation. Easy mark, that is what he is." The words struck like a blow to the chest, sharper and colder than anything he had said at the table. In that instant, the mockery in front of strangers seemed almost mild compared to the cruelty of this truth. Derek had not just mocked me for entertainment. He had been using me all along, manipulating my love for my daughter, exploiting the sacrifices I had made with no intention of ever showing gratitude. His friend laughed, shaking his head. "Seriously? After all this time, he still gives you money?" Derek smirked, lowering his voice but not enough to keep me from hearing. "Of course, he thinks he is helping, thinks he is being the good father. But really, he is just too blind to see he is being played. Sarah does not say anything because she knows it keeps our lives comfortable. Why would she ruin that?" My breath caught as the words sank in. Not only was Derek mocking me, but he was dragging Sarah into the scheme, painting her silence as complicity rather than weakness. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps her silence at the table was not just fear or discomfort. Perhaps it was agreement. Perhaps all those years of financial support had become so ingrained in her life that she had stopped seeing them as sacrifice and started seeing them as obligation. I pressed my back against the wall, my fist clenched at my sides, forcing myself to stay quiet. My first instinct was to storm around the corner, to confront him then and there, to let the truth spill into the open. But I stopped myself. A confrontation in that hallway would only give him more satisfaction, more material to twist against me later. What I needed now was not anger, but clarity. For the first time in years, I saw my situation with absolute precision. Derek's words had stripped away the illusions I had built around my sacrifices. I was not valued, not respected, not even tolerated. I was being used, plain and simple. As I stood there, listening to him boast, I felt something inside me harden. The pain of betrayal was sharp, but it was also cleansing. It burned away the fog of denial I had lived in, the belief that my sacrifices were building something meaningful. I understood then that my role in their lives had been reduced to nothing more than a source of comfort, a steady hand always ready to pay, never to be acknowledged. Derek finished his drink, slapped his friend on the shoulder, and laughed again. He will keep paying. He always does. It is who he is. With that, they moved back toward the dining area, their laughter echoing through the hallway until it faded into the murmur of the restaurant. I remained where I was for a long moment, breathing slowly, letting the weight of what I had heard settle into my bones. My humiliation at the table had been cruel, but this truth was far more devastating. And yet, beneath the pain, I felt something else stir. A cold clarity, a determination that I had not felt in years. Derek believed he had me figured out, believed I would always be the easy mark, the open wallet, the fool too blinded by love to see the truth. What he did not realize was that tonight had changed everything. I straightened my blazer, smoothed my tie, and walked back toward the table. My expression was calm, my steps steady, but my heart carried a fire Derek could not see. He thought he had humiliated me, thought he had used me without consequence. What he did not know was that he had just given me the knowledge I needed to change the game forever. When I returned to the table, everything looked exactly as it had before. Derek was laughing at something Sarah had said, his glass of wine tilted carelessly in his hand, while Sarah smiled faintly, her expression a mask that concealed the unease beneath it. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like an ordinary evening, a family sharing a pleasant meal. But as I slid back into my seat, I knew the truth. I had overheard Derek's words, had listened to his boasting, had felt the sting of his casual cruelty as he called me an easy mark. That knowledge changed the way I looked at everything. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and for the first time in years, I saw my relationship with them for what it truly was. The food on my plate no longer mattered. The chatter of the restaurant faded into background noise. All I could focus on was the certainty settling deep in my chest. The humiliation I had felt earlier was no longer raw. It had cooled, hardened, crystallized into something sharper. Derek's mockery had wounded me, but his private words had given me clarity. Every sacrifice I had made, every bill I had paid, every time I had stepped in to shoulder a burden that was not mine, had been seen not as love but as weakness. I was not valued as a father or respected as a man. I was simply a resource, a bank account dressed in modest clothes, a steady hand they believed they could exploit indefinitely. I watched Derek as he leaned back in his chair, confident and smug, as though he had already won some unspoken contest. His arrogance was almost unbearable now that I knew the truth. He thought he had me trapped, thought that no matter what he said or did, I would continue to give, because that was the role I had always played. In his eyes, I was predictable. A man too blinded by his love for his daughter to ever say no. For the first time, I considered the possibility that he had never respected me from the beginning, that every smile, every polite word had been part of a performance designed to keep me giving. Sarah, sitting quietly beside him, was harder to look at. Her silence at the table already weighed heavily on me, but Derek's words about her struck deeper still. Was she complicit? Did she see me as nothing more than a provider as well? Or had she simply become so accustomed to my support that she no longer recognized it as sacrifice? I searched her face for an answer, but she gave me nothing. Her eyes avoided mine, her attention fixed on her fork as she pushed food around her plate. Whatever the truth was, I realized then that I could no longer deny it. The bond between us was not what I had believed it to be. Something had shifted long ago, and tonight it had become impossible to ignore. I felt strangely calm as these thoughts settled into place. The fire of anger that might have consumed another man did not rise in me. Instead, there was a cold steadiness, a clarity that felt almost like relief. I had spent so many years giving without question, convincing myself that it was worth it, that I was building a future for my daughter. Now I understood that what I had been building was something entirely different. I had constructed a cage for myself, one made of obligation and guilt, and Derek had learned how to lock the door from the outside. As I lifted my glass of wine and took a slow sip, I realized that the choice before me was clear. I could continue as I had, pretending not to see the truth, allowing them to use me until there was nothing left. Or I could change. I could take back what was mine, not just the money I had given, but the dignity and peace of mind I had sacrificed along the way. Derek believed he knew me, believed he had already mapped out the rest of my life. But what he did not realize was that tonight, in mocking me, he had given me the strength to see beyond his performance. I looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time I did not feel the sting of his arrogance. Instead, I saw him for what he was, a man who relied on others to prop up the illusion of success, a man who mocked what he did not understand, a man who mistook generosity for weakness. That realization steadied me. It reminded me that my worth had never been tied to what I gave, but to who I was. Sarah glanced up briefly, her eyes meeting mine, and for a heartbeat I thought she saw the change in me. Perhaps she sensed the calm that had replaced the humiliation, the resolve that had settled behind my stare. She quickly looked away again, but it did not matter. I knew what I had to do. I set my glass down carefully, my expression still composed, my hands steady. To Derek, it might have looked as though nothing had changed, as though his words had rolled off me without consequence. But inside, everything had changed. The cold realization was complete. I had given enough. I had sacrificed enough. And from that night forward, things would never be the same again. The decision to remain calm was not made lightly. Every fiber in me wanted to stand, to raise my voice, to confront Derek and Sarah right there in front of everyone. I could have told the entire restaurant what I had overheard in that hallway, exposed Derek for the manipulator he was, and demanded that Sarah acknowledge what had just been revealed. But as I sat at that table, the cool glass of wine in my hand, I understood something important. Rage would only feed Derek's narrative. Anger would make me look weak, out of control, exactly the image he wanted to paint of me. True strength would not come from shouting, but from holding my composure when he least expected it. So I smiled. It was not a wide or forced smile, but a calm, measured one, the kind that spoke of patience and quiet confidence. Derek looked at me curiously, perhaps expecting me to sulk in silence or excuse myself for the evening. Instead, I raised my glass slightly, as though acknowledging his little performance earlier. He smirked, thinking he had won, but he did not understand that his victory was nothing more than an illusion. When the server returned with the bill, Derek made no move toward it. He leaned back in his chair, his arm resting lazily on the back of Sarah's seat, confident that I would do as I always had. Sarah avoided my eyes, fiddling with the edge of her napkin, waiting for me to reach into my pocket and pay as I had countless times before. This, too, was part of the performance, a ritual they had grown accustomed to, and for the final time, I played my part. I reached for the check, glanced at it briefly, and pulled out my wallet. The leather was worn from years of use, much like myself, but inside it still held enough to cover the excesses of others. I placed my card on the tray with a steady hand, and the server nodded before disappearing once more. There was no hesitation, no complaint, no sign of bitterness. I paid as I always did, and in that moment Derek and Sarah likely thought nothing had changed. But within me, everything was different. This would be the last bill I ever paid on their behalf. This act, performed with the same calmness as every time before, was not a continuation. It was closure. "Thank you for dinner," I said evenly once the server returned, setting down the receipt for me to sign. My voice carried no trace of sarcasm or anger, only quiet sincerity. "I will think about what you both said tonight. You have given me a lot to consider." Derek raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening, interpreting my words as submission. He likely thought I had accepted his mockery as truth, that I would leave the restaurant chastened and eager to prove my relevance by giving even more. Sarah offered a small nod, clearly relieved that I had not escalated the evening into a conflict. Neither of them realized that my words carried an entirely different meaning. They believed I was agreeing to their perspective. In reality, I was promising myself that their chapter in my life was coming to an end. I signed the receipt, tucked my card back into my wallet, and rose slowly from my chair. "It was a good evening," I said calmly, though I knew it was anything but. My composure made Derek lean back with a satisfied grin, while Sarah gave me a half-smile that never reached her eyes. I placed a hand gently on the back of my chair, paused for a moment, and then added, "Enjoy the rest of your night." With that, I turned and walked toward the exit, my footsteps steady, my expression controlled. I felt the weight of their eyes on my back, Derek likely amused by what he thought was my quiet acceptance. Sarah uncertain but unwilling to question me. I did not look back. To them, I was leaving in silence, a man who had endured humiliation and chosen to remain passive. But in truth, my silence was not weakness. It was strategy. The cool night air greeted me as I stepped outside, the city lights reflecting on the polished glass of the restaurant's facade. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that felt freer than any I had breathed in years. The calmness I had shown at the table was not a mask. It was real. For the first time, I understood the power of restraint, the strength of choosing not to reveal everything you carry. Derek believed he had succeeded in belittling me. He believed I had walked away unchanged. What he could not know was that my calm response had been the first step towards something far greater than anger. I walked to my car slowly, my hands tucked into my pockets, the city alive around me with sounds of traffic and distant laughter. My vehicle looked small and out of place among the rows of expensive cars, yet I felt no shame as I approached it. That car had served me faithfully for years, carrying me to work, carrying Sarah to school, carrying us through storms and hardships. It represented honesty, resilience, and practicality. It represented me. And as I sat inside, starting the engine with its familiar hum, I realized I would rather drive that car with dignity than ride in luxury while being mocked by those I had sacrificed for. That night, I drove home in silence, the road stretching ahead of me like a promise. Derek thought the evening had ended with him triumphant. Sarah thought it had ended with me quietly retreating. But in truth, it had ended with the beginning of a plan. My calm response had been my shield, but it would also be my sword. They would never see it coming. The house was quiet when I returned that evening. I hung my blazer neatly on the hook by the door, loosened my tie, and sat at the small wooden desk that had been my companion for years. On its surface lay stacks of unopened envelopes, old receipts, and files I had kept out of habit rather than purpose. For a long time I simply stared at them, my mind replaying the night at the restaurant, Derek's smug face, Sarah's silence, and above all the words I had overheard in that hallway. I was an easy mark. That was how he saw me, how he spoke of me when he thought I was not listening. The words echoed in my chest, not as anger now, but as a steady reminder that something had to change. I pulled open the top drawer and began removing folders, laying them across the desk in neat stacks. Each folder contained fragments of my life. Utility bills I had covered for Sarah when she first moved out, tuition invoices from her college years, credit card statements showing charges I had paid off to keep her free of debt. One by one, I opened them, the memories flooding back with each slip of paper. There was the bill from the orthodontist who had fitted her braces, the receipt for her first car's down payment, the check stub from the photography package at her wedding. Every number told a story of sacrifice, of love expressed not in words but in action. Hours passed as I sorted through the piles, creating a timeline of financial support that stretched back decades. I tallied amounts in a notebook, the pen scratching across the paper as I added one figure to another. The numbers grew quickly, far beyond what I had anticipated. College tuition alone had consumed nearly 180, a sum I had worked tirelessly to provide. The wedding had taken another 25 from my retirement account, an amount I had told myself I would recover eventually, but never truly did. Then there were the smaller but endless contributions. Rent checks slipped under her door, groceries purchased when money was tight, furniture bought to fill their home, repairs for cars that were not mine. Individually, these seemed insignificant at the time. Together they formed a staggering total. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the notebook where the sum stared back at me in black ink. It was enough for a retirement I had postponed for years. Enough for travel, for hobbies, for a life of rest after decades of labor. Instead, it had gone into building a life for Sarah and Derek, a life they now enjoyed with little acknowledgement of the sacrifices behind it. The irony was not lost on me. I had given up my own future to secure theirs, and in return, I had been mocked publicly and dismissed privately as nothing more than a convenient resource. As I continued to sort through the files, a strange calm settled over me. This process was not just about money. It was about clarity. For years I had carried the weight of sacrifice without ever truly examining it, believing it was simply what fathers did. But now, with every receipt and statement laid out before me, I could see the truth in tangible form. This was not just generosity. It was a lifetime of investment that had been squandered by entitlement and disrespect. The work stretched late into the night. The clock ticked past midnight as I organized the paperwork into folders labeled by category: education, housing, transportation, wedding. Each one represented a chapter of my life, a chapter where I had chosen to give without hesitation. As I closed the final folder and stacked them neatly, I felt a sense of completion, as though I had finally gathered the evidence of my own story. Derek had called me an easy mark, but I now held in my hands the proof that I had been far more than that. I had been the foundation of their lives, and it was time to decide what that foundation would support moving forward. Before I left the desk, I opened a fresh page in my notebook and wrote down a single sentence: "No more." The words looked small on the page, almost insignificant compared to the mountain of numbers surrounding them, but to me they carried the weight of a lifetime. No more quiet sacrifices, no more unquestioned support, no more being taken for granted. The decision was not made in anger, but in resolve, a calm determination that I would reclaim the life I had postponed for too long. I closed the notebook, placed it carefully on top of the stack of folders, and turned off the lamp. The room sank into darkness, but inside me a new light had begun to glow. The research phase was complete. I had gathered the truth, laid it out plainly, and seen it for what it was. The next steps would require careful planning, but for the first time in years, I felt ready. Derek believed he knew who I was, believed he could predict my every move. He had no idea that I was already beginning to write a story he would never expect. The morning after I gathered all my records, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the folders spread neatly in front of me. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting lines of gold across the papers that told the story of my sacrifices. I had spent the night reviewing them, tallying the numbers until my eyes blurred, but the clarity remained sharp. I knew what I had to do. Derek and Sarah had relied on me for so long that they had mistaken my love for weakness, my silence for endless willingness. That illusion had ended. If I was to take back my life, I needed more than resolve. I needed protection. By mid-morning, I found myself in the waiting room of a law office downtown. The building was tall and glass-fronted, polished to perfection, filled with the quiet hum of people moving with purpose. I felt out of place in my modest clothes, surrounded by clients in tailored suits and glossy shoes, but I reminded myself why I was there. This was not about appearances. This was about securing the future I had nearly lost. When my name was called, I followed a young assistant into a spacious office lined with shelves of thick legal books. Behind a large mahogany desk sat a lawyer in his 50s, his posture straight, his eyes sharp but kind. He rose to shake my hand firmly, introducing himself as Mr. Lawson, a specialist in estate planning and asset protection. His handshake was steady, the kind of grip that spoke of confidence built over years of practice. I felt a sense of relief in that moment, as though I had finally stepped onto solid ground. We sat down, and he asked me what had brought me there. I hesitated at first, unsure how to condense years of sacrifice, betrayal, and humiliation into words that would make sense in a legal setting. But slowly, carefully, I explained. I told him about my wife's passing, about raising Sarah alone, about the decades of financial support that had carried her into adulthood. I told him about Derek, about the wedding I had helped pay for, about the bills I had covered even after Sarah was married. Finally, I told him about the dinner, about Derek's public mockery, and the words I had overheard that revealed just how little respect they had for me. Mr. Lawson listened without interruption, his pen scratching across a yellow legal pad as he took notes. His face gave little away, but his eyes narrowed slightly when I spoke of Derek calling me an easy mark. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers, and regarded me with quiet seriousness. "You have been generous," he said carefully, "but generosity without limits can become exploitation. The good news is, it is not too late to protect yourself. You have already done the hard work of gathering records. That will make this process much easier." He began to outline the steps I could take. First, we would review all my accounts, insurance policies, and retirement funds to ensure that my daughter and son-in-law had no legal claim over them. Next, he suggested revising my will to remove them as beneficiaries, redirecting my estate to a trust that would protect my assets from manipulation. He recommended canceling any automatic payments tied to their household and advised me to establish legal barriers that would prevent them from accessing my finances under any circumstance. As he spoke, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift. Each suggestion was like a stone being removed from a burden I had carried for too long. For the first time, I realized that I had the power to take control of my life, to draw boundaries that Derek could not cross, no matter how charming or manipulative he tried to be. Mr. Lawson assured me that everything we discussed was entirely within my rights. "You owe them nothing," he said firmly. "You have already given more than most parents ever would. It is time you think about yourself. If they cannot respect you, then they have no claim to what you have worked for." The words struck deep. For years I had believed that love meant giving, that a good father never stopped providing. But hearing those words from a professional, from someone who understood both the law and human nature, was liberating. I realized that love does not mean allowing yourself to be diminished. Love also means protecting your dignity. We spent hours going through the details. He made copies of my records, highlighting key expenses, noting the totals that demonstrated just how much of my life I had poured into supporting Sarah and Derek. By the end of the meeting, we had a clear plan. Within weeks, my will would be rewritten, my accounts secured, my insurance policies updated. Every financial tie that bound me to Derek and Sarah would be severed, not in anger, but in self-preservation. As I shook Mr. Lawson's hand at the end of our consultation, I felt a calm resolve settle over me. Derek thought he had me figured out, thought he could manipulate me indefinitely. What he did not realize was that I had already begun building a wall around my future, one he would never climb. Sarah's silence had hurt me, but it had also shown me the truth. And the truth was that I no longer owed them anything. Walking out of that office into the bright afternoon sun, I felt lighter than I had in years. The legal process was only beginning, but the decision had already been made. Derek and Sarah had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They would soon discover the difference. Once the legal framework was set in motion, I knew my next step was to act carefully and deliberately. Mr. Lawson had given me the tools to protect myself on paper, but the true test would be in how I carried out each decision. Derek thrived on assumption. He believed I would always pay, always show up, always give, without question. That assumption was his comfort, and I planned to dismantle it piece by piece without him even realizing what was happening until it was far too late. I began with the small things, the details that had once seemed too insignificant to matter. For years, I had set up automatic payments for Sarah's phone bill, the one she had struggled with as a young adult. Over time, that payment had become a fixture, a silent stream of money flowing out of my account each month without thought. The first step was to cancel it. I contacted the provider, transferred the account fully into her name, and ensured no future charges would touch my finances again. It was a small act, but symbolic. One thread of the financial web was cut cleanly. Next came the shared accounts. Derek and Sarah had convinced me years ago to open a joint account for emergencies, promising they would only use it if something urgent arose. In reality, it had become another lifeline, one they dipped into whenever their own spending left them short. I visited the bank personally, sat down with a manager, and closed the account. Every penny left inside I transferred into my private savings. The manager asked if I wished to notify the other account holders, and I shook my head. No notifications, no explanations. Let Derek and Sarah discover it on their own when they tried to withdraw what was no longer theirs to touch. I turned my attention to my insurance policies. Sarah had been listed as a beneficiary since she was a child, a choice that had once seemed natural and unquestionable. But now, with Derek in her life, I could not risk my years of work falling into his hands. Mr. Lawson had already drafted the changes, and I filed the paperwork without hesitation. The same was true for my retirement funds. Every beneficiary designation was rewritten, every access point sealed. I chose instead to place my assets into a trust managed by professionals who understood my wishes. My legacy would no longer be an open door for Derek's greed. The process took weeks, but I was patient. I kept my routine outwardly the same, never giving Sarah or Derek reason to suspect the storm gathering beneath the surface. I visited them occasionally, shared meals, even laughed at small jokes, all while knowing that behind the scenes I was carefully severing every tie. Each step was timed deliberately, each action carried out with precision. I wanted the unraveling to come not as a sudden blow, but as a series of shocks that would leave them scrambling, confused, and desperate. At night, I returned to my desk, reviewing the folders, checking off items one by one. Phone bill canceled, joint account closed, insurance updated, retirement secured, credit cards no longer shared. Every mark I made on the list brought a quiet satisfaction, a reminder that I was reclaiming what had been mine all along. For years, I had lived as if my life was no longer my own, as if it belonged to Sarah's comfort and Derek's ambition. Now, for the first time in decades, I was living for myself. I thought often of my wife during this time. I imagined her watching as I carried out each step, her quiet strength guiding me through the process. She had always believed in balance, in giving without losing oneself. I had strayed from that balance, blinded by love and duty, but I knew she would have understood why I was making these changes. I was not abandoning Sarah. I was reclaiming dignity. I was teaching her, even now, that love should never mean exploitation. Strategic planning also meant emotional restraint. I resisted the urge to confront Derek prematurely, resisted the temptation to reveal the truth before the time was right. Each time I saw his smug grin or heard his casual remarks about money, I reminded myself that patience was my weapon. Anger would only serve him. Patience would undo him. I waited, building each piece of the plan carefully, until all that remained was the moment when they would discover how completely the ground had shifted beneath their feet. When the final changes were complete, I sat at my desk once more, the folders neatly stacked, the notebook filled with check marks. For the first time in years, I felt light. I had spent so long living under the weight of sacrifice that I had forgotten what freedom felt like. Now, as I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair, I understood that freedom was not just the absence of obligation, it was the presence of choice, and I had chosen to end the cycle of exploitation once and for all. The day I finished the last of the paperwork, I felt as though a chapter of my life had closed with finality. All that remained was the execution of the plan, the quiet severing of every financial tie that had bound me to Derek and Sarah. It was not a task I approached with anger, but with precision, as if I were a craftsman, dismantling a structure piece by piece until nothing of the original frame remained. Each action was deliberate, each decision the product of long nights spent in thought and careful consultation. I had built the foundation of their lives, and now I was reclaiming it stone by stone. The first step was my insurance. For years, Sarah had been the sole beneficiary of my life insurance policy, a decision I had made when she was still a child clinging to my hand after her mother's funeral. It had seemed unthinkable then to name anyone else. But time had changed her world and mine, and now I could not risk Derek gaining access to the fruits of my labor. With a steady hand, I signed the documents that removed her from the policy and replaced her with the trust Mr. Lawson had established. The signatures were simple, yet the meaning was profound. For the first time in decades, my financial legacy was secured against manipulation. Next came my retirement accounts. These funds represented the countless hours I had spent in factories, in offices, and inside jobs that kept me working long after others had retired. Every dollar in those accounts had been earned through sweat and sacrifice, and yet I had allowed Sarah and Derek to believe it was part of the safety net they could always rely upon. That illusion ended the moment I filed the beneficiary changes. The accounts were shifted into the trust, untouchable by anyone but those I had specifically chosen to manage them. No phone call from Derek, no pleading visit from Sarah would ever unlock those funds again. Then I turned to the smaller ties, the subtle lifelines that had kept them tethered to me. Their names were removed from my emergency contacts at the bank. Their access to my credit line, granted years ago during a supposed short-term hardship, was terminated without explanation. I canceled every automatic transfer, every recurring payment, every silent gift that left my account before I even noticed it. The more I looked, the more I realized how deeply the threads of obligation had been woven into my finances. Cutting them one by one was not just a matter of practicality. It was liberation. The process took weeks, but with each step I felt lighter. I began to walk differently. My shoulders no longer slumped beneath the invisible weight of unending sacrifice. I slept better, knowing that my hard work was no longer being siphoned away by entitlement. Even my modest home seemed brighter, the walls less oppressive, as if the house itself understood that I had finally chosen to protect what I had built. Through it all, I kept my demeanor unchanged whenever I saw Derek or Sarah. I smiled when appropriate, listened politely to their stories, even agreed to small visits. I never once revealed what I was doing. Patience remained my shield. To them, I was still the dependable father, the silent provider who would always be there. They did not realize that every visit brought them closer to the moment when they would reach for support and find nothing but air. The most difficult part was removing them from my will. I sat in Mr. Lawson's office once more, the documents spread across the polished desk, and I signed with a calm hand. It was not the erasure of my daughter that pained me, but the acknowledgement that she had allowed herself to be consumed by Derek's influence. By leaving her in the will, I would only be rewarding his arrogance. By removing her, I was protecting the legacy I had built. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, yet I knew it was the right one. When it was done, I walked out of the office and into the sunlight, my steps firm, my chest steady. The serving was complete. Derek and Sarah no longer had a claim to my future, no foothold in my finances, no invisible threads tying me down. They still believed in the illusion of my generosity, but soon they would learn that illusions dissolve when tested. And when that moment came, they would understand that the man they had mocked and dismissed was not a fool. He was their foundation, and without him, their carefully constructed world would begin to crack. That night, I returned home and sat once more at my desk, the folders neatly stacked, the notebook filled with check marks. I opened it to the final page and wrote 2 words beneath the long list of completed tasks. It's done. For the first time in years, I felt entirely free. My sacrifices had ended. My future was mine again. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as I was finishing my coffee and preparing to start the day. The phone buzzed on the counter, Derek's name flashing across the screen. For a moment I considered letting it ring out, but curiosity urged me to answer. I knew the changes I had made would soon begin to surface, and I suspected this call might be the first ripple. With a calm breath, I pressed accept and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said evenly, as if nothing in my life had changed. On the other end, Derek's voice was sharp and restless. "Hey, something's wrong with the account. The rent payment bounced. Do you know anything about that?" I leaned back in my chair, the corner of my mouth curling slightly. So it had begun. "What account are you talking about?" I asked, my tone steady, almost casual. "The joint account," he snapped. "The one we use when things get tight. The payment didn't go through, and the bank said the account was closed. What happened?" I let a pause stretch between us, long enough for him to feel the weight of silence. "Oh," I said finally, "I closed it." There was a beat of stunned silence on the other end. Then his voice rose, strained with disbelief. "You, what? You closed it? Without telling us?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "It was time." His breath came fast, uneven, the sound of a man grappling with something he could not comprehend. "Time? Time for what? You know we rely on that account. Sarah told me you set it up for us, so we wouldn't have to worry. And now you just—" He stopped himself, as though the words forming in his throat were too raw to say aloud. I let him struggle, my silence deliberate. Finally, I said, "You're both adults. You have jobs. You can manage your own rent." The phone crackled with the force of his frustration. "You don't understand. The landlord expects payment this week. If it doesn't go through, we're in trouble. You can't just cut us off without warning." "I can," I said, my voice calm but firm. And I did. The line went quiet again. I imagined him pacing, running his hand through his hair, that smug grin wiped clean from his face. For the first time, Derek was no longer in control. He tried again, his tone shifting from anger to forced reason. "Look, maybe this was just a mistake. Maybe the bank made an error. You should call them and straighten it out. We need that account. You know we do." "No mistake," I replied. "I spoke to the bank myself. The account is gone. From now on, your finances are yours alone." The sharpness in his voice returned, fueled by desperation. "Do you realize what this means? Without your help, we're drowning. We've got bills stacked up, loans, car payments. You can't just walk away like this." I took a sip of coffee, savoring the moment. I already did. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I could hear his breathing, heavy and uneven, and then he finally broke. "Sarah's going to be devastated. She's your daughter. Don't you care about her at all?" "I care," I said quietly. "That's why I'm doing this. Caring doesn't mean being used. It doesn't mean letting myself be mocked and treated like a fool while I carry the weight of your lives. You told someone once that I was an easy mark, Derek. I heard you, and you were wrong. That account was the first step. The rest will follow." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could feel his shock, his mind racing to process what I had just revealed. He knew I had overheard him. He knew the game had changed. Finally, his voice came, low and unsteady. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this." "No," I said, my voice calm and steady. The only mistake would have been continuing as before. The only regret I carried was believing that my sacrifices were appreciated. Now I know the truth, and I'm free from it. I ended the call without waiting for a response, setting the phone down on the counter. My heart was steady, my breathing calm. The discovery had been his, not mine. Derek had discovered that the foundation he had built his arrogance upon had crumbled beneath him. And this was only the beginning. As I finished my coffee, I thought about how many more calls would come. Calls filled with anger, with begging, with attempts to manipulate. Each one would be another reminder that I had chosen the right path. The discovery call had been their first taste of reality, and soon reality would consume the life they had built at my expense. The call from Derek had confirmed what I already knew. The unraveling had begun, but the true reckoning came a few days later when he phoned again, this time with Sarah beside him. Their voices carried a mixture of panic and forced authority, as though if they spoke loudly enough, they could bend me back into the man they thought I was. I let the phone ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but to remind them that I no longer leapt to their demands. "Dad?" Sarah's voice began, trembling at the edges. "We need to talk. Things are difficult right now. Derek told me the account is gone. Is that true?" "It is true," I said calmly. "The account has been closed. The payments have stopped. I have taken care of everything that connected my finances to yours." There was a pause. Then Derek cut in, his tone sharp. "You can't just do that. You can't pull the rug out from under us without warning. Do you realize how much pressure we're under? Bills are piling up. The landlord is threatening us. We've got payments overdue. You think this is the time to abandon us?" I let his words wash over me, unshaken. "I did not abandon you," I said slowly. "I took your advice." "My advice?" Derek scoffed. "What are you talking about?" I leaned back in my chair, my voice steady, deliberate. "You once said I lived too modestly, that I clung to old habits, that I had never really learned how to enjoy life. You mocked my car, my clothes, my ways. You laughed in front of strangers, painting me as a man stuck in the past. And you told someone you trusted, that I was nothing more than an easy mark, a fool who would keep paying no matter what." The line went silent. For the first time, I could feel Derek's confidence falter. Sarah gasped softly, the sound of a woman realizing her father knew more than she wished he did. "Yes," I continued, my voice calm but firm. "I heard you. I was there in the hallway. I listened as you told your friend that my sacrifices were not love but stupidity, that my generosity was weakness, that I was nothing more than a wallet for your convenience. I heard you, Derek, and that was the moment everything changed." Sarah's voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Dad, he didn't mean it like that. It was just talk. You know how people exaggerate." "No," I said sharply, though my tone never rose. "He meant it exactly like that. And the silence at that table told me you knew more than you let on. You did not defend me. You did not stand by me. You allowed him to belittle me because it was easier than telling the truth." That silence spoke louder than anything Derek said. Derek tried to recover, his voice rising again. "So what? You think you can just walk away after everything? You've been helping for years. You set a precedent. You can't just pull out now because of one misunderstanding. One misunderstanding? I repeated, letting the words hang heavy. Decades of sacrifice were mocked in one evening. My love was twisted into obligation. My role as a father was reduced to nothing more than financial convenience. That is not a misunderstanding, Derek. That is the truth you let slip when you thought no one was listening. And now I have listened, and I have acted. Sarah's voice broke. So what happens now? Are you saying you won't help us at all anymore? I breathed deeply, allowing the moment to sink in. I am saying that I have finally chosen to help myself. I am saying that I took Derek's advice and upgraded my life. Not with new clothes or cars or restaurants, but with freedom. My retirement is mine again. My savings are mine again. My dignity is mine again. You both told me, in your own way, that I should learn to live differently. So I listened. I changed. And now I will live my life without being used. The silence on the line was thick, broken only by Derek's heavy breathing. I could almost see the fury in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when someone defied him. Sarah, however, said nothing. Perhaps she understood, at least in part, that the damage was done and could not be undone with excuses. Finally, Derek snapped, his voice dripping with anger. You'll regret this. You think you're in control, but you're just cutting off your own family. You'll end up alone. I smiled faintly, unseen by them. I have been alone before, I said softly, and I survived. I raised Sarah alone after her mother died. I built a life with my own hands. I know how to stand alone, Derek. The real question is whether you know how to stand without me. I ended the call before he could reply, setting the phone down with a calm hand. My heart was steady, my mind clear. The revelation had been made, the truth spoken aloud for the first time. Derek and Sarah now knew that I was no longer their safety net, no longer their easy mark. I had reclaimed my life, and there was no turning back. It did not take long for Derek and Sarah to realize that my words were not empty. Within weeks, the reality of their situation began to unfold. Payments that once flowed smoothly from my accounts were no longer there to soften their obligations. The rent fell behind. The car loan notices began to arrive. Credit card balances swelled as they tried to cover expenses they had grown accustomed to letting me handle. Their comfortable life, built quietly on my back, was starting to unravel, and soon enough, desperation drove them to my doorstep. I was in the garden when they arrived, the afternoon sun warm on my shoulders as I trimmed the hedges. Their car pulled up hastily, gravel crunching beneath the tires. I did not look up immediately, choosing instead to finish clipping one more branch before turning slowly toward them. Sarah stepped out first, her face pale, her hands clutching a folder of papers. Derek followed, his usual confidence dimmed but not entirely gone. His expression a mixture of anger and forced calm. "Dad," Sarah began, her voice already quivering. "We need to talk, please." I set the shears down gently and wiped my hands on a cloth. "I told you everything I needed to say on the phone," I replied, my tone measured. She stepped closer, her eyes pleading. "We're in trouble, real trouble. The bank is threatening foreclosure. They say if we don't catch up on payments, we'll lose the house. The car might be repossessed any day now. Please, you can't just stand by and watch this happen." I studied her face, the desperation etched into every line. My heart ached at the sight of my daughter in distress, but I kept my resolve steady. "For years, I carried you through every hardship. I gave without hesitation. I sacrificed without complaint. And when I needed your respect, you gave me silence. When I needed your defense, you gave me nothing. Why should I step in now? Derek finally spoke, his voice tight with restrained fury. Because this isn't just about us. This is about family. You're her father. That means something. You can't just cut her off like she's a stranger. I met his gaze evenly. And what did being a father mean to you when you mocked me in front of strangers? When you called me an easy mark behind my back? Did being family mean anything then? He faltered for a moment, his jaw clenching. Then he shifted tactics, his voice softening. Look, I was wrong. I shouldn't have said those things. I was just trying to be funny. I didn't mean them. We were all drinking, and I got carried away. But now we're drowning, and you're the only one who can help us. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Please, Dad. I know I should have spoken up that night. I know I failed you. But we're begging you now. If you don't help us, we're going to lose everything. Her words tugged at me, but the memory of that dinner was still sharp. The silence she had chosen then spoke louder than her pleas now. I thought of the decades of sacrifice, the mountain of receipts stacked on my desk, the life I had postponed for their comfort. And I thought of the clarity I had found in the weeks since I cut them off, the peace of knowing that my future was finally my own. You will not lose everything, I said quietly. You will lose the luxuries you cannot afford. You will lose the life you built on money that was not yours to begin with. But you will not lose everything. You still have each other. You still have your jobs. You are capable adults. If you want to keep what you have, then work for it, the way I did. Derek's mask cracked then. The anger he had been holding back spilled out. This is your fault. You spoiled her. You made her think life would always be easy, and now you're punishing us for it. If you had just kept helping, none of this would be happening. I raised my chin, my voice firm. No, Derek, this is your fault. You mocked the hand that fed you. You disrespected the man who carried you when you stumbled, and you thought it would never end. But it has. Sarah sobbed openly, clutching Derek's arm, but he shook her off and glared at me. You'll regret this when you're alone in that house, with no one to visit you. I bent down, picked up the shears again, and turned back to the hedge. I have known loneliness before, I said quietly, and I survived it. What I will not survive again is being treated like a fool. You both made your choices. Now you will live with them. They stood there for a moment longer, as if hoping I would relent. But when I did not look up, Derek cursed under his breath and pulled Sarah back toward the car. She looked over her shoulder at me, her face streaked with tears, but I did not waver. The engine roared, gravel scattered, and they drove off, leaving the air heavy with the sound of desperation unmet. I stood in the garden for a long while after they left, the shears resting in my hands. My heart ached for my daughter, but my resolve remained firm. They had pleaded, begged, even threatened, but nothing they said could undo the truth. The cycle of exploitation was over. They would learn to stand without me, or they would fall. Either way, I was free. The desperate pleading had not swayed me, and deep down I knew it would not be the last time they came to me. When people grow used to leaning on someone else, they rarely stop after a single rejection. They return, again and again, convinced that persistence will wear down resolve. Derek and Sarah were no different. Weeks passed with phone calls, texts, and letters slipped into my mailbox. Some were filled with anger, accusing me of betrayal. Others were dripping with apology, promising change if only I would step in one last time. I ignored them all, But eventually, I knew they would come back in person. That day came on a gray Saturday afternoon. I was sitting in my living room, reading by the window, when I heard the car pull into the driveway. The sound was harsher this time, as though Derek had pressed the accelerator with frustration rather than care. I set my book down and waited. The knock at the door was sharp, demanding. I opened it slowly, revealing Derek and Sarah standing there. Their faces told the story before their words did. Sarah's eyes were swollen, her cheeks streaked with tears. Derek's jaw was tight, his posture rigid, his expression caught between fury and desperation. They looked not like a couple in control of their lives, but like people cornered by the consequences of their own arrogance. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking, "please, can we come in?" I stepped aside, allowing them into the house, though I knew why they were there. They sat on the couch across from me, Sarah clutching her hands together, Derek leaning forward with elbows on his knees. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Derek finally broke it. "We're out of options," he said flatly. "The bank has started foreclosure proceedings. The car was repossessed yesterday. We're drowning, and you could fix all of this with a single check. Why are you doing this to us?" I looked at him evenly, my voice calm. "I am not doing this to you. You did this to yourselves. I gave for years more than any father should have been asked to give. I paid for your education, your home, your wedding, your bills. And in return, I was mocked, belittled, and dismissed. You stood in a restaurant and laughed at me, Derek. You called me an easy mark when you thought I could not hear. And Sarah, you sat in silence when your husband humiliated me in front of strangers. That was the moment everything changed." Sarah's face crumpled, tears spilling freely. "I know I failed you that night. I know I should have spoken up. But please, Dad, we're your family. Doesn't that still mean something?" I shook my head slowly. Family is not built on exploitation. Family is not silence when respect is required. Family is loyalty, love, and honesty. What I saw that night was not family. It was a performance, one where I was cast as the fool. Derek's composure cracked, anger flaring in his eyes. "You think you're so noble, sitting here with your little savings, acting like you're better than us. But without you, we're ruined. You hear me? Ruined. And when we lose everything, it'll be on your conscience." I leaned forward slightly, my gaze steady. "No, Derek, it will be on yours. You built your life on the back of my sacrifices, and you never once showed gratitude. You saw me not as a father, but as a wallet. You thought I would always be there. You were wrong." He stood abruptly, his fists clenched. For a moment, I thought he might lash out, but Sarah caught his arm, pulling him back down. Her sobs filled the room, raw and desperate. "Please, Dad," she begged. "I don't care about the house or the car. I just don't want to lose you. I don't want this to be the end." Her words pierced me, but I could not let them undo the truth. "Sarah," I said softly, "I love you. That has never changed. But love does not mean allowing myself to be disrespected. Love does not mean carrying a burden while being mocked for it. If you want a relationship with me, it must be built on respect, not money. And as long as Derek stands beside you with contempt in his heart, there will be no place for me in your lives." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Derek's face was red with rage, but he said nothing. Sarah wept quietly, her body trembling. Finally, I stood, walking to the door and opening it wide. "This conversation is over. I wish you both the strength to face what comes next. But I will not carry you anymore." They sat frozen for a moment, Then Derek rose sharply, pulling Sarah up by the arm. She looked back at me as they walked out, her eyes pleading for something I could not give. I held her gaze, steady and unyielding, until she turned away. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood in the silence of my home, the weight of the confrontation settling over me. My heart ached for my daughter, but my resolve was unbroken. Derek and Sarah now knew the full truth. They had taken advantage of me for the last time, and with that door closed, so too was the chapter of my life that had been defined by sacrifice without respect. Months passed after the confrontation, and with each passing week, the weight that had once pressed on my shoulders grew lighter. For the first time in decades, I no longer lived in a constant state of sacrifice. My days became my own, unshackled from the endless cycle of giving without respect. The silence in my home, once heavy with loneliness, became a source of peace. It was no longer the silence of abandonment, but the silence of freedom. I began to travel, something I had postponed for too long. I visited the coast, where I walked along beaches I had only seen in magazines, the waves washing over my feet as if to cleanse the years of burden I had carried. I hiked through mountains, the air crisp and clean, each step reminding me of the strength still left in my body. I visited small towns where no one knew me, where I could sit in a cafe with a book and feel like just another person living his life. With every journey, I felt the years of sacrifice transform into something new, something that belonged only to me. The money I had once poured into Sarah and Derek's lives now funded my own experiences. I upgraded my home in small ways, not with extravagance, but with comforts I had always denied myself. A new armchair for the living room, fresh paint on the walls, a garden that flourished because I finally had the time to tend it. Each change was modest, but each one carried meaning. They were reminders that I had chosen to live for myself, to value my own happiness as much as I had valued theirs for so long. Occasionally, I would still receive messages from Sarah. Some were brief, polite updates about her daughter, my granddaughter. Others were longer, filled with apologies and attempts to mend what had been broken. I read each one carefully, and while my heart ached, I did not respond. I loved her still, but love without respect cannot thrive. Until she understood that, until she truly saw me as more than a source of provision, I could not allow her back into my life in the same way. It was not punishment. It was protection for both of us. From Derek, the messages were different. Short, sharp demands disguised as requests, sprinkled with reminders of family obligations. I ignored them all. His words no longer had power over me. He had mocked me once, called me an easy mark, and believed that I would never change. Now, he was learning that the man he thought he controlled had reclaimed his freedom. Despite the occasional reminders of their struggles, I felt no guilt. For years I had carried guilt like a shadow, convincing myself that I owed more, that I had not done enough. Now I knew the truth. I had done more than enough. I had given years of labor, countless sacrifices, and unwavering love. What I received in return had been silence and scorn. Letting go of them financially was not abandonment. It was justice. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun set behind the trees, I realized that I was no longer haunted by the past. The betrayal, the humiliation, the silence at the dinner table, all of it had become part of the story that led me here. A story of sacrifice, of awakening, and ultimately of freedom. I was no longer the man mocked by his son-in-law or ignored by his daughter. I was simply myself, a man who had learned the value of dignity. The world felt open again, full of possibilities I had once believed were beyond my reach. Retirement was no longer a dream pushed aside, but a reality I embraced with both hands. I found peace, not in wealth or luxury, but in the knowledge that my life was finally my own. And though Sarah and Derek still struggled in the wake of their choices, I knew their fate was no longer tied to mine. That, too, was peace. I looked out across the horizon and smiled. My journey had not been easy, but it had been necessary. I had given, I had lost, and I had reclaimed. And in the end, I had found freedom. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.